There's a certain kind of mind that feels like it never clocks out. Even when the world quiets, even when nothing urgent is happening, it keeps spinning, turning over the smallest details as if they hold the keys to something crucial. And if you've ever wondered why some people can't stop thinking, why their own mind feels like a noisy upstairs neighbor who refuses to sleep, you know exactly how heavy that can feel. Not chaotic in a dramatic way, but in that subtle, gnawing way that makes you wonder whether your mind is working for you or dragging you behind it. What's strange is that this overthinking doesn't always come from fear. Sometimes it feels like curiosity on overdrive. Other times it's a survival habit, a way of trying to stay ahead of the unexpected. And occasionally, it's because the mind is convinced that if it just keeps analyzing, it can finally unlock that one insight, that one perfect angle that makes everything click into place. There's a kind of hope buried in it, almost like the brain is bargaining with reality. If I think enough, I'll finally feel in control. But that's the trick. People who can't stop thinking aren't necessarily seeking answers. They're chasing the feeling of certainty, a feeling that rarely arrives. There's something Machiavelli observed, not as a grand philosophical statement, but hidden between his lines whenever he talked about the instincts that drive people. He understood that the mind clings to control when it senses unpredictability. For some, that instinct becomes strategy. For others, it becomes mental noise. When control isn't available externally, the mind tries to create it internally. And that's where the non-stop thinking begins, as a substitute for power in an environment that feels unstable. But that's only one layer. Another layer is the way some people carry an almost microscopic sensitivity to meaning. They don't just see events, they see patterns, subtext, implications. A simple conversation becomes an ecosystem of possible interpretations. A small decision becomes a branching tree of outcomes. And while this hyper-perceptiveness can be a strength, it also turns the mind into an overactive detective, searching for clues that may not even exist. You can spot this kind of thinker by the way they replay conversations in their head, not out of insecurity, but out of a strange compulsion to understand every angle. They'll analyze a tone of voice, an unexpected pause, the way someone phrased something, and they'll project entire internal worlds onto it. Not because they want to, but because their mind won't settle for incomplete information. This can create a subtle kind of exhaustion. The brain keeps insisting there's one more layer to peel back, one more possibility to explore, one more reason or hidden motive waiting under the surface. And when the mind assumes everything has deeper meaning, it becomes almost impossible to relax. Yet, here's what's often overlooked. The inability to stop thinking isn't random. It usually stems from one of a few psychological patterns that develop early. For some, it begins with unpredictability in their environment. If you grew up never quite knowing how people would react or what the next day might hold, your mind learned to anticipate, to scan, to predict, to analyze. That pattern doesn't switch off just because life gets calmer. The brain still runs the old program, constantly bracing, constantly preparing, constantly trying to stay one step ahead of a threat that may not even be there anymore. For others, it stems from being highly introspective. Some people naturally process life from the inside out rather than the outside in. They don't move through the world reacting, they move through it interpreting. They try to understand everything at a fundamental level, and that curiosity grows into a kind of internal engine that never cools. And then there are those who overthink because they've been rewarded for it in the past. They were the ones who caught details others missed, predicted outcomes no one saw coming, solved problems by noticing what everyone else overlooked. Overthinking, for them, became a strategy that worked until it didn't. It's difficult to let go of a habit that once offered protection or advantage. What makes this even more complex is that the brain loves loops. Once a certain kind of thinking becomes automatic, it stops feeling like a choice. It feels like a default state, something you're passively experiencing rather than actively doing. Someone who can't stop thinking doesn't wake up and say, "I'm going to overanalyze everything today." They wake up and the thoughts are already mid-sentence. But here's something people rarely talk about. For many overthinkers, silence is uncomfortable. Not because silence itself is scary, but because silence creates space. Space for emotions, space for uncertainty, space for vulnerability. A constantly busy mind becomes a shield, a way to avoid confronting feelings that don't have neat solutions. Thinking becomes a distraction disguised as productivity, and that's where the loop tightens even more. The mind works overtime to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. It becomes convinced that if it pauses, even for a moment, some unresolved emotional truth will surface. So instead of resting, it thinks and thinks and thinks. You can see this most clearly at night, when everything slows down and the world stops demanding your attention. The mind suddenly has no external tasks to latch onto. That's when it turns inward, often aggressively. Thoughts multiply, old memories resurface, imagined scenarios branch out. The brain tries to negotiate with hypothetical futures. It's like the mind refuses to let the body sleep until it has reviewed the entire day's emotional ledger. If you've ever laid awake replaying something you said 5 years ago, that wasn't random. That was the brain reaching for unresolved threads, trying to tie them up, even though time has already moved on. People who can't stop thinking often have a deep need to finish the story in situations that no longer have a conclusion. There's another piece to this puzzle, and it's one many people won't admit, even to themselves. Overthinking sometimes masks a fear of making the wrong move. When the stakes feel high, even if only in your mind, every decision demands perfect clarity. The brain becomes a courtroom, and every option gets put on trial. This creates a feeling of paralysis disguised as caution. The more you think, the more variables you uncover. The more variables you uncover, the harder it is to decide. And the harder it is to decide, the more you think. It's like trying to walk through a maze while building it at the same time. And yet people who can't stop thinking are often incredibly insightful. They develop a radar for nuance, an instinct for patterns, a keen awareness of human dynamics. They just struggle to turn that mental power off when it's no longer useful. Their thoughts spill into moments where presence would serve them better. What's fascinating, though, is that most overthinkers don't actually want fewer thoughts. They just want quieter ones. Thoughts that arrive gently instead of crashing in all at once. Thoughts that feel helpful instead of heavy. Thoughts that cooperate instead of compete for attention. And that reveals something essential about the psychology of people who can't stop thinking. The issue isn't the volume of thoughts, it's the relationship they have with them. They try to manage their mind the way someone might try to rearrange a river, moving each drop one by one. But rivers don't calm by force. They calm when the environment around them shifts. And understanding that shift begins with noticing how the mind uses thinking the way some people use armor. Not to harm others, but to protect themselves from certain kinds of emotional exposure. This creates a tension inside them, a quiet tug-of-war between intellectual clarity and emotional avoidance. And the moment you start seeing that pattern, something interesting happens. The mind loses a bit of its grip. The thoughts don't stop, but they start to feel less like commands and more like suggestions. That subtle shift is where things begin to change, because once you notice the pattern, you can finally see the mind not as a pressure system constantly pushing you, but as a messenger delivering information you don't always have to act on. That realization feels small at first, almost like a quiet click rather than a breakthrough. But it marks the point where overthinking stops feeling like an unstoppable force and starts becoming something you can observe instead of obey. But to understand what that shift actually looks like, you have to dig into the deeper psychology behind all this mental noise. People who can't stop thinking often carry a contradictory belief about themselves. They trust their mind more than anything, yet they doubt their conclusions more than anyone. Their thoughts feel sharp, but their certainty feels fragile. So they analyze again, and again, and again, hoping the next round of thinking will give them the confidence they didn't get from the last one. It creates this strange mental treadmill where deep insight and self-doubt run side by side. And the more intelligent or perceptive a person is, the more elaborate their internal arguments become. They don't spiral because they're irrational. They spiral because they can imagine too many possibilities. Their brain is like a movie director with an unlimited budget, shooting alternate versions of every scenario, each with a slightly different outcome. After a while, even choosing which version to believe becomes exhausting. This tendency to imagine multiple routes isn't just mental busywork. It's actually rooted in a heightened sensitivity to consequences. Some minds don't just think about what could happen, they feel what could happen. Every imagined outcome carries emotional weight, even if it's unrealistic. This amplifies the internal pressure to think ahead, prepare, anticipate. It's like the future reaches back into the present and tugs on the mind, saying, "Deal with me now, so I don't surprise you later." And then there's the emotional undercurrent most overthinkers never talk about. The longing for a version of themselves who is always composed, always prepared, always in control. Overthinking becomes the training ground for that ideal self, even if the training never ends and the finish line never arrives. There's an unspoken belief that if they think enough, they can prevent regret, embarrassment, or pain. They try to outsmart human vulnerability itself. This is where Machiavelli's insight becomes surprisingly relevant. He often talked about how people overestimate their ability to control outcomes and underestimate the role of uncertainty. Overthinkers fall into that exact trap, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep wish to minimize their own exposure to unpredictability. Ironically, the more they try to control their thoughts, the more uncontrollable those thoughts become. The mind doesn't respond well to force, it responds to understanding. And that's where a lot of people misinterpret overthinkers. On the outside, it looks like they're obsessing over details, but on the inside, they're wrestling with invisible contradictions. They want simplicity, but create complexity. They want peace, but seek clarity. They want certainty, but generate more questions. These opposing forces build pressure, and the mind tries to resolve it the only way it knows how, by thinking harder. What's even more interesting is how people who can't stop thinking tend to live in two timelines at once. In the present, they may be perfectly calm, engaging, thoughtful, but internally, their mind is running simulations of yesterday, projections of tomorrow, and reinterpretations of now, all at the same time. It's like juggling three versions of reality, each demanding attention. This creates a kind of cognitive fatigue that's easy to mislabel as stress, when in reality, it's more like emotional multitasking. The brain wasn't designed to keep so many tabs open. When too many windows are running in the background, even simple tasks feel heavier than they should. You're not imagining that sense of heaviness. It's the weight of unresolved mental tabs pulling on your attention. There's also a social layer to all of this. People who can't stop thinking often assume others do it too. They underestimate how much of their internal world is invisible to everyone else. This can make them feel misunderstood, not in a dramatic way, but in that quiet ache of realizing their effort isn't always visible. Imagine someone replaying a conversation for hours to make sure they didn't say the wrong thing, while the other person barely remembers the exchange. That mismatch can make overthinkers feel like they're living in a different psychological reality from the people around them. But the most compelling part of this entire dynamic is what happens when an overthinker tries to stop thinking. For most people, silence feels peaceful. For an overthinker, silence feels like someone just dimmed the lights but left the door open. The mind doesn't trust quiet. It assumes something must be wrong, because the absence of noise isn't familiar. So it fills the silence with what-ifs, should-haves, and maybe there's more to it. This is why simple advice like just relax or stop overthinking never works. You can't force the mind into quiet if quiet feels unsafe. You have to make quiet feel safe first. And here's where things take a turn most people don't expect. A mind that never stops thinking is usually incredibly good at one thing: noticing patterns. That skill can be turned inward. The moment you catch yourself analyzing a situation for the 10th time, you can use that same pattern recognition instinct to ask, why this thought? Why now? And suddenly, the thought isn't something you're inside of, it's something you're looking at. That subtle shift is powerful. When you study the thought instead of being swept up by it, you reclaim agency. The thought stops being the narrator and becomes the subject. And the moment that happens, the intensity softens. You don't have to argue with the thought, or dismiss it, or wrestle with it. You simply see it, and the mind relaxes when it feels seen. People who can't stop thinking often underestimate how much their mind wants cooperation, not control. Thoughts aren't enemies, they're signals. Some signal fear, some signal hope, some signal unresolved emotions waiting to be acknowledged. And some are just mental echoes with no meaning at all. When you can tell the difference, the noise starts losing its power. Another thing overthinkers rarely realize is how much their body influences their mind. A tense body creates a tense brain. Shoulders pulled tight, breath shallow, jaw clenched. The mind interprets all of this as a sign that something is wrong. It responds by increasing vigilance, which increases thinking. The loop isn't just mental, it's physical. Sometimes the mind isn't overthinking because of a thought. It's overthinking because the body is signaling danger when there is none. And once you understand how these layers interact, the emotional, the physical, the cognitive, something starts to unravel. You begin to notice how many of your thoughts weren't actually yours, but habits. How many of your worries weren't warnings, but echoes. How much of your mental noise was simply unprocessed sensitivity, filtered through years of trying to stay ahead of life. At some point, the mind realizes it doesn't need to think its way through everything. It can feel its way through some things. It can experience some things. It can let certain questions go unanswered without collapsing. And maybe the most surprising part is that underneath the constant thinking, there's often a quiet, intuitive intelligence waiting for space. A kind of knowing that doesn't explain itself or argue or analyze. It just sits there, steady, patient, drowned out by the noise, but never gone. The mind that never stops thinking isn't broken. It's simply loud. And when the noise dims, even slightly, that quiet intelligence becomes clearer, like a radio finally tuning into the right frequency. And somewhere in all of this, people begin to learn that clarity isn't something the mind produces by force. It's something that emerges when the mind trusts it can stop bracing for impact, when it trusts that uncertainty isn't a threat, when it trusts that not every emotion needs a theory, and not every possibility needs a plan. And that's when the mind finally learns to rest, not because it ran out of things to think about, but because